A house was burned down just because the owner refused to pay HOA fees. Sounds insane, right? But the fire was real, and the one behind it was a woman in a suit, clipboard in hand, smiling like nothing was wrong. From that moment, it stopped being just a neighborhood issue. I had no idea they'd bring in a third party. I didn't expect I'd have to use that old business card, the name I'd tried to leave behind. This story made headlines, but here on QA Stories, you'll hear everything they didn't print. What would you have done if you were me? Tell me in the comments. I should probably start by telling you who I am. My name is Luke Thompson, and at 45 years old, I thought I had seen everything the legal world could throw at me. After 20 years as a property rights attorney, I decided to retire early and enjoy the quiet life. Maybe that was my first mistake. I mean, looking back, I should have known that nowhere is truly quiet when you're dealing with people who think they can control everyone around them. But at the time, all I wanted was a peaceful place to call home, somewhere I could finally relax without constantly fighting other people's battles in courtrooms. Maple Grove seemed perfect when I first drove through it. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, the kind of neighborhood where you'd expect friendly waves, and maybe the occasional block party. I bought a beautiful colonial-style house on Elm Street, nothing too flashy, but comfortable enough for a guy who just wanted to tend his garden and read legal thrillers on the porch. The realtor mentioned something about an HOA, but honestly, I wasn't paying much attention. I figured it was just one of those standard things where they make sure people don't paint their houses neon green or leave broken cars on their lawns. How naive was I, right? The first few weeks were exactly what I had hoped for. I set up my home office, planted some roses in the front yard, and even installed a bird feeder because, hey, why not embrace the suburban dream? My neighbors seemed friendly enough. There was Emily Green next door, an investigative journalist who worked from home, and Tom Anderson across the street, a retired security director who always seemed to be washing his car or trimming his hedges. Normal people doing normal things. I actually started thinking I had made the right choice moving here. Then Laura Blackwell showed up at my door. I remember it was a Tuesday morning, around 9:30, and I was enjoying my coffee on the front porch when this woman came marching up my walkway like she owned the place. Laura Blackwell, sharp-suited and storming toward my door like she owned the entire neighborhood. She introduced herself as the executive director of some nonprofit organization and, more importantly, the president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. The way she said it, you'd think she was announcing she was the Queen of England or something. "Mr. Thompson," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I need you to sign these documents to officially join our Homeowners Association. The annual fee is $2,300, and there are several compliance issues we need to address immediately." She thrust the papers at me like I was supposed to be grateful for the privilege. I'm not even sure why, but something about her tone immediately rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she assumed I would just comply without question, or maybe it was how she was already talking about compliance issues when I hadn't even been living there for a month. Either way, I could feel my attorney instincts kicking in. I took the papers and flipped through them, and honestly what I saw made my blood boil. These weren't reasonable community guidelines. These were control mechanisms designed to micromanage every aspect of how people lived in their own homes. Paint colors had to be approved from a pre-selected palette. Garden decorations required written permission. Even the type of mailbox you could install was regulated down to the specific shade of black it had to be painted. I looked up at Laura, who was standing there with this smug expression like she had just handed me the deal of a lifetime. "I'm refusing," I said simply, "not because I don't understand the law, but because I don't want to be controlled by you. I can spot red flags from the first glance." The look on her face was priceless. It was like no one had ever said no to her before in her entire life. Her perfectly composed expression cracked for just a second, and I saw something ugly underneath. Something that told me this woman was used to getting her way, and she didn't like being challenged. Not one bit. I'd dealt with bullies before, but never in hiking boots and fake smiles. Laura's voice hardened immediately. "You'll regret this decision, Mr. Thompson. This community has standards, and we don't make exceptions for anyone." The way she said anyone had this weird emphasis to it, like there was some hidden meaning I was supposed to understand. But at the time, I just figured she was one of those people who took HOA rules way too seriously. I handed the papers back to her and told her to have a nice day, thinking that would be the end of it. Yeah, right. If only I had known what I was getting myself into. Just 2 days later, I found a citation tucked under my windshield wiper. $500 for mailbox not meeting community color standards. I actually had to laugh when I read it. My mailbox was black exactly like every other mailbox on the street, but apparently it wasn't the right shade of black according to their precious regulations. Standing there in my driveway holding that ridiculous piece of paper, I realized this wasn't going to be a simple disagreement. Laura Blackwell had just declared war. But as she turned back up the hill, clipboard swinging, I knew something worse than noise was coming. Laura didn't waste any time showing me exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. That week slips piled under my door mailbox gnome even a damn wind chime. It was like she had assigned someone to watch my property 24/7, just waiting for any excuse to slap me with another fine. The grass height citation was for $300 because my lawn was exactly 2 3/4 inches tall when their regulation specified a maximum of 3 inches. I mean, seriously, we're talking about a 1/4 inch of grass here. The garden gnome citation was even more ridiculous. $200 for an unauthorized garden gnome that was maybe 6 inches tall and hidden behind a bush. You'd have to be actively looking for it to even notice it was there. But somehow, Laura's eagle eyes had spotted it during one of her apparent surveillance rounds. The wind chime citation pushed me over the edge because my chime was hanging exactly where the previous owner had installed it, in the same spot where 3 other neighbors had identical chimes. But according to Laura's interpretation of the rules, mine was somehow different enough to warrant a $350 fine. Now, here's where my background as a property rights attorney came in handy. Instead of getting angry and disputing each citation individually, which is what most people would do, I decided to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. I spent an entire weekend researching the HOA's bylaws, their incorporation documents, and their procedural requirements. What I found was fascinating, and not in a good way for Laura. She had violated multiple procedural requirements in issuing these citations hadn't followed. Proper notification procedures hadn't allowed for the required appeal period, and most importantly, had exceeded her authority as defined in the association's governing documents. That's when Emily Green knocked on my door. I had seen her around the neighborhood, always carrying a camera or a notebook, and I knew she worked as an investigative journalist for one of the local papers. She was maybe in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed and direct in that way that good reporters tend to be. "Luke," she said, "I've been watching what's happening with Laura and your citations. I think you should know that I saw her with surveyors around your property yesterday. They were taking measurements and making notes, but they didn't have any city permits posted. That got my attention immediately because surveyors don't just show up without a reason, and they definitely don't work without proper permits." Tom Anderson wandered over while Emily and I were talking. Tom was this retired security director who seemed to know everything that happened in the neighborhood, probably from his years of professional paranoia. He was a big guy, maybe 60 years old, with the kind of presence that suggested he had seen his share of trouble over the years. "There's been unusual activity around here lately," he said, glancing toward Laura's house down the street. "People coming and going at odd hours, cars I don't recognize. Something's not right." Coming from someone with Tom's background, that kind of observation carried weight. It wasn't just neighborhood gossip, it was a professional assessment. I decided to dig deeper into what Laura was up to, and what I found shocked me even more than the ridiculous citations. She had secretly filed a boundary dispute with the county, claiming that part of my property actually belonged to something called a community easement. According to her filing, a strip of land about 10 feet wide along my eastern property line was supposedly designated for community use, which would give the HOA the right to access and control that area. The problem was this easement didn't exist in any of the original property records, and there was no legal basis for it whatsoever. The paperwork was professionally prepared, complete with surveyor's reports and legal citations. I told her again that this wasn't an HOA not for me. She just smiled like I was reciting the alphabet wrong. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment harassment campaign because Laura had invested serious time and money into this attack on my property rights. She had hired lawyers, paid for surveyor services, and filed official documents with the county. This was a coordinated, deliberate attempt to steal part of my land, all because I had refused to join her homeowners association. The level of vindictiveness was honestly breathtaking, and I started keeping detailed records of every interaction, every citation, every suspicious activity around my property. That night, I noticed someone had moved the garden chair 2 inches. I hadn't touched it, but someone had. My legal training kicked in automatically, and I began building what I knew would eventually become a case file with photos, timestamps, copies of all correspondence, and witness statements from Emily and Tom. I had handled enough harassment cases to know that documentation would be crucial if this situation continued to escalate. And based on Laura's behavior so far, I was pretty sure it was going to get worse before it got better. I was sitting in my study reviewing all the evidence I had collected when my phone rang. It was Tom, and he sounded worried. "Luke, there's smoke coming from your direction. I'm looking out my window right now, and I can see an orange glow." My heart stopped because I dropped the phone and ran to the window, and sure enough, there was a flickering orange light coming from somewhere near my backyard. For a split second, I wondered if I was being paranoid, if maybe it was just a neighbor having a late-night barbecue or something harmless like that. But then I smelled the acrid scent of something burning that definitely shouldn't be burning. And just before midnight, a beam of light swept across my window. Not moonlight, a flashlight. Turns out that orange glow wasn't my house burning down, thank God. It was actually Tom's neighbor on the other side burning some old furniture in their backyard fire pit, which was probably against city ordinances, but seemed pretty harmless compared to what I was imagining. But the false alarm taught me something important about my state of mind because I was getting paranoid, and maybe rightfully so because Laura's harassment campaign was clearly just getting started. I mean, when you're jumping at every shadow and assuming the worst about every flickering light, that's probably a sign that someone has successfully gotten inside your head. The next morning, I was drinking my coffee and trying to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting to the whole situation when two men showed up at my door. They weren't the kind of guys you would expect to see in a neighborhood like Maple Grove. Both of them were big, probably in their 40s, wearing expensive suits that didn't quite hide the fact that they were built like they spent serious time in the gym. The older one handed me a business card that read, "Mountain Peak Security Solutions," and introduced himself as Mike, while his partner didn't bother giving me a name, just stood there, looking intimidating and scanning my property like he was making mental notes. "Mr. Thompson," Mike said with this weird smile that didn't reach his eyes, "we understand you've been having some security concerns in the neighborhood. We'd like to offer you our protection services." The way he said protection services had this old school mafia vibe to it that made my skin crawl, because I'm not kidding when I tell you that this guy could have been straight out of a movie about organized crime. Everything about him screamed professional intimidation, from his perfectly polished shoes to the way he kept his hands visible but ready. These weren't security consultants. These were thugs in expensive suits. I asked them who had sent them, and Mike's smile got even more unsettling. "Let's just say that certain community leaders are concerned about your well-being. There have been reports of unusual activities in this area, and we wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to someone who's new to the neighborhood." His partner chimed in with this casual comment about how accidents could happen to people who don't cooperate with the community. The whole conversation felt like something out of a bad gangster movie, except this was happening on my front porch in broad daylight in suburban Colorado. Clipboard, Steve loitered near my boundary stakes again, and I realized the intimidation tactics were escalating on multiple fronts simultaneously. Instead of showing fear or backing down, I decided to play it smart by thanking them politely for their concern, telling them I'd think about their offer, and asking for their business cards and license information. The whole time I was mentally photographing their faces, noting the license plate of their black SUV, and recording the conversation on my phone. These guys thought they were dealing with some suburban retiree who would be easily intimidated, but they had no idea what kind of training I actually had. After they left, I immediately ran background checks on Mountain Peak Security Solutions, and what I found made my blood run cold. The company was registered to a post office box in Denver, had no legitimate business address, and was owned by a shell corporation. But the really interesting part came when I dug deeper into the ownership structure, because the shell company was connected to a network of businesses that I recognized from previous cases. This wasn't just some local intimidation scheme. Mountain Peak was a front for organized crime operations, and Laura had somehow gotten connected to people who played for keeps. They weren't amateurs. Someone had erased their tracks, mud-cleaned footprints, scattered. I'd seen that kind of cover-up before. Not from soccer moms. I sat in my study staring at the computer screen, trying to process what this meant. Because Laura Blackwell wasn't just some power-hungry HOA president anymore. She was connected to organized crime, or at least she was willing to hire criminals to solve her problems. The woman who was upset about my mailbox color and my garden gnome had just sent actual mobsters to my door. It was so absurd that I almost couldn't believe it was real. That evening, Emily called me in a panic. "Luke, there's a black van that's been parked outside my house for the last 3 hours. The license plate is covered with mud, and there are at least 2 people inside just sitting there watching the street." I looked out my window, and sure enough, there was the van positioned perfectly to have a clear view of both our houses. These guys had crossed the line from intimidation to actual surveillance because they weren't just trying to scare me anymore. They were studying my routine, learning my habits, preparing for something bigger that I couldn't even imagine yet. I told Emily to stay inside and keep her doors locked while I figured out what to do next. The smart move would probably be to call the police and report the suspicious vehicle, but I knew that would just result in the van driving away and coming back later. These guys were professionals, and they knew how to stay just within the bounds of legal behavior while making their intentions crystal clear. They were playing games, but what they didn't know is I'd once signed off on wiretaps racketeering charges. I wasn't just a cabin guy with a shovel. I was a federal judge. Tom called again, and his voice was tight with concern. "Luke, I just saw 2 more vehicles drive through the neighborhood real slow, circling back around your block. This isn't random anymore. The pieces were falling into place, and none of them looked good for what was coming next, because surveillance was always the step right before escalation in these kinds of operations. By the time I realized what they were doing to the property line, the paperwork had already been filed. And that wasn't the worst of it. What happened next was like something out of a nightmare, except I was wide awake, and it was all too real. Those containers I had seen on the thermal cameras weren't filled with threats or intimidation tactics. They were filled with accelerant. By the time I managed to call 911 and get through to the dispatcher, orange flames were already licking at my windows, and the smoke was so thick I could barely breathe. I had maybe 3 minutes to grab whatever I could carry and get out of there before the whole place went up like a matchbox. Looking back, I'm amazed I had the presence of mind to grab my laptop with all the evidence I had been collecting. The fire department showed up within minutes, but it was already too late to save anything meaningful. I knelt where the porch used to be, fingertips pressing into soot. The heat was gone, but its echo still trembled through my bones. Everything I owned, every memory, every piece of furniture that had meaning to me, it was all gone. The damage estimate would later come in at $250,000, but that number didn't even begin to capture what I had really lost. Photo albums from my childhood law books that had been with me since my first day of practice, my wife's record collection melted into a single black disc that I picked up anyway. The most infuriating part was watching Laura Blackwell show up at the scene about 20 minutes after the fire trucks arrived. She came rushing down the street with this perfectly performed expression of shock and concern, like she was auditioning for the role of caring neighbor in some community theater production. "Oh my God, Luke, I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said, putting her hand on my arm with fake sympathy that was so obvious it was insulting. "You must be devastated. Please, you are welcome to stay in my guest house until you can figure out what to do next." I actually had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the sheer audacity of it all. But here's the thing that really got to me. Laura's performance was so convincing that some of the neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle actually seemed to buy it. I could see them nodding sympathetically as she spoke like she was some kind of saint for offering to help the poor victim of this terrible accident. Accident. That's what everyone was calling it. The fire chief was already talking about possible electrical problems or a gas leak standard explanations for house fires that start in the middle of the night. Nobody seemed to be considering the possibility that this might have been deliberate, except for Tom Anderson, who caught my eye from across the street and gave me a look that said he knew exactly what had really happened here. The insurance investigator showed up the next morning, and I could tell immediately that he was suspicious about the timing of everything. "Mr. Thompson," he said, flipping through his clipboard full of forms, "I have to ask you about the recent disputes you've been having with your neighbors. Our initial investigation suggests that this fire started in multiple locations simultaneously, which is unusual for accidental fires. Yet I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe someone in an official capacity was finally taking this seriously. But then he continued with questions that made it clear he was considering me as a suspect in my own case. Standing in the ruins of my kitchen, answering questions that basically accused me of burning down my own house, I realized that Laura had played this perfectly. She had created a situation where I looked like the most likely suspect in my own case. After all, who burns down their own house for insurance money, according to the investigator's line of questioning, and who had been acting erratically lately, getting into conflicts with neighbors and attracting visits from suspicious men? Me, at least according to the version of events that Laura had been spreading around the neighborhood. The woman was diabolical in her ability to twist every situation to her advantage. I didn't call anyone the first day, or the second. I watched the ash settle like snow, while Emily showed up with her journalist instincts kicking in as she surveyed the scene and started taking photographs of everything. "Luke," she said quietly, when the investigator was out of earshot. "I got some of it on camera. I've been keeping my security system running 24/7 since this whole thing started, and I caught footage of at least 2 people moving around your property right before the fire started. The quality isn't great because it was dark, but it's something. For the first time since watching my house burn down, I felt like I might actually have a chance at proving what had really happened." That evening, I was sitting in a cheap motel room about 10 miles from Maple Grove, staring at my laptop screen and trying to figure out my next move when something clicked in my brain. I had been thinking about this whole situation, like a victim reacting to Laura's attacks instead of taking control of the narrative. But I wasn't just some helpless suburban retiree. There was nothing left but ashes in a frame, and in that silence I heard myself whisper, "This ends." Standing in the ashes of 20 years of memories, I understood that this wasn't a civil dispute anymore. This was attempted murder conspiracy and federal arson. By day 4, I opened the steel box under my bed, the one I hadn't touched since Boston. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Rachel Green, Denver PD detective, someone I had worked with on dozens of organized crime cases during my prosecutorial career. If anyone would take my situation seriously and know how to handle it properly, it would be Rachel. I didn't know if she'd answer, but I dialed anyway using the only number that hadn't changed in 20 years. When she picked up, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Rachel, this is Judge Luke Thompson. Someone just committed federal arson against me, and I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Rachel's voice came back sharp and focused. The silence on the other end lasted for about 5 seconds, which in a conversation like this felt like an eternity. Then Rachel's voice came back, and I could hear the shift in her tone from casual surprise to professional attention. "Luke, did you just tell me you're a federal judge? Since when?" I had to laugh despite everything that had happened, because even my old colleagues didn't know about my recent appointment to the federal bench. I had been keeping it quiet, planning to start my new position after taking a few months to settle into retirement. But circumstances had obviously changed, and it was time to play every card I had in my hand. "It's a recent development," I told her, "but that's not the important part right now. What's important is that someone just burned down my house in what I believe was a coordinated attack by organized crime figures hired by my HOA president. And before you ask if I've lost my mind, I have documentation, witness statements, and partial video evidence of the whole conspiracy." Rachel's response was immediate and exactly what I had hoped for. "I'm on my way. Don't talk to anyone else about this until I get there, and whatever you do, don't leave that motel room. If what you're telling me is true, you could still be in danger." Within 2 hours, my crappy motel room had been transformed into the command center for a federal investigation. Rachel had arrived with FBI agents from the Denver field office, and they had brought enough equipment to conduct a full forensic review of everything I had collected over the past few weeks. Agent Sarah Martinez, who specialized in organized crime and arson cases, spread my evidence across the bed like she was laying out pieces of a puzzle. "Judge Thompson," she said, and I have to admit it felt good to hear someone use my proper title. "This is some of the most thorough documentation I've ever seen from a civilian. You've basically built our entire case file for us." In the corner of my crawlspace sat 3 dusty boxes marked HOA Archive. I hadn't looked inside since the depositions. I ripped the tape. The agents were particularly interested in the connection between Mountain Peak Security and the crime family I had helped prosecute years earlier. Agent Martinez pulled up files on her laptop that showed the current status of the organization, and what she found was disturbing. The leadership we took down has been replaced, but the operational structure is still intact. They've moved into what they call suburban consulting, which is basically organized crime services for white-collar clients who want plausible deniability. Your HOA president appears to have been one of their customers. Rachel coordinated with the FBI to execute simultaneous search warrants on Laura's home and the Mountain Peak offices first thing the next morning. I wasn't allowed to be present during the searches, obviously, but Rachel called me with updates throughout the day, and each call brought more incriminating evidence. Laura's home computer contained email correspondence with Mountain Peak dating back 3 weeks, including discussions about property solutions and neighborhood security measures. Her bank records showed a payment of $20,000 to a consulting firm that was registered to the same post office box as Mountain Peak Security. Something told me I wasn't wrong, but I'd need more than instinct to make it stick. But the real smoking gun came from Mountain Peak's office files. The FBI found detailed surveillance reports on my daily routine photographs of my property from multiple angles and what appeared to be a timeline for escalating harassment tactics, culminating in what they called property disposal. Agent Martinez told me that the language used in these documents was consistent with organized crime terminology for arson, and that similar language had appeared in other cases involving the same criminal network. Laura hadn't just hired thugs to intimidate me. She had hired professional criminals to systematically destroy my life. 2 days after I made contact, Laura showed up alone. No clipboard, no smile. She stood at the tree line and stared. The news about the federal judge arson investigation leaked to the media within 24 hours, which is pretty typical for high-profile cases involving public officials. Suddenly, every reporter in Colorado wanted to know about the HOA president who had allegedly hired the mob to burn down a federal judge's house. Laura's carefully constructed reputation as a pillar of the community started crumbling immediately. The nonprofit organization where she worked as executive director placed her on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her as president effective immediately. I have to admit, watching Laura's world fall apart was more satisfying than I had expected it to be. Emily showed me the article she had written for the Denver Post about the whole situation. She had been investigating Laura's background for weeks, and what she had discovered was fascinating. Laura Blackwell had a history of escalating conflicts in every community where she had lived, always using her position in local organizations to harass people who disagreed with her. She had been asked to resign from 2 previous HOA positions in other states, and there were pending civil lawsuits from former neighbors who claimed she had engaged in similar harassment campaigns against them. The pattern was becoming clearer by the hour, and it wasn't just about my situation anymore. 3 days after the search warrants were executed, Rachel called me with the news I had been waiting for. "Luke, we've got her. Laura Blackwell is being arrested this morning on federal charges including conspiracy, arson, and civil rights violations under the federal hate crime statutes. The maximum sentence she's looking at is 50 years in federal prison, and that's before we factor in the organized crime enhancements." I asked Rachel about the hate crime charges, and she explained that the FBI had found evidence suggesting that Laura's targeting of me had been motivated partly by what she perceived as my outsider status in the community. That night, an envelope was slid under my door. No return address. Inside, a photo of me in robes handing down a sentence. They knew. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted for about 5 seconds, which in a conversation like this felt like an eternity. Then Rachel's voice came back, and I could hear the shift in her tone from casual surprise to professional attention. "Luke, did you just tell me you're a federal judge? Since when?" I had to laugh despite everything that had happened, because even my old colleagues didn't know about my recent appointment to the federal bench. I had been keeping it quiet, planning to start my new position after taking a few months to settle into retirement. But circumstances had obviously changed, and it was time to play every card I had in my hand. "It's a recent development," I told her, "but that's not the important part right now. What's important is that someone just burned down my house in what I believe was a coordinated attack by organized crime figures hired by my HOA president. And before you ask if I've lost my mind, I have documentation, witness statements, and partial video evidence of the whole conspiracy." Rachel's response was immediate and exactly what I had hoped for. "I'm on my way. Don't talk to anyone else about this until I get there, and whatever you do, don't leave that motel room. If what you're telling me is true, you could still be in danger." Within 2 hours, my crappy motel room had been transformed into the command center for a federal investigation. Rachel had arrived with FBI agents from the Denver field office, and they had brought enough equipment to conduct a full forensic review of everything I had collected over the past few weeks. Agent Sarah Martinez, who specialized in organized crime and arson cases, spread my evidence across the bed like she was laying out pieces of a puzzle. "Judge Thompson," she said, and I have to admit it felt good to hear someone use my proper title. "This is some of the most thorough documentation I've ever seen from a civilian. You've basically built our entire case file for us." The agents were particularly interested in the connection between Mountain Peak Security and the crime family I had helped prosecute years earlier. Agent Martinez pulled up files on her laptop that showed the current status of the organization, and what she found was disturbing. The leadership we took down has been replaced, but the operational structure is still intact. They have moved into what they call suburban consulting, which is basically organized crime services for white-collar clients who want plausible deniability. Your HOA president appears to have been one of their customers. The idea that organized crime had evolved to the point where suburban HOA disputes could escalate to arson was almost too bizarre to believe, but the evidence was right there in front of us. 3 black SUVs pulled into the cul-de-sac at 6:17 a.m., tires grinding gravel, curtains twitched. Mrs. Henderson stepped outside in pearls and panic. Laura was already on the lawn, barefoot, shielding her face from the morning light. Federal agents moved in with clipped voices and folders thick with receipts. Rachel coordinated with the FBI to execute simultaneous search warrants on Laura's home and the Mountain Peak offices first thing that morning. I wasn't allowed to be present during the searches, obviously, but Rachel called me with updates throughout the day, and each call brought more incriminating evidence. Laura's home computer contained email correspondence with Mountain Peak dating back 3 weeks, including discussions about property solutions and neighborhood security measures. But the real smoking gun came from Mountain Peak's office files. The FBI found detailed surveillance reports on my daily routine photographs of my property from multiple angles and what appeared to be a timeline for escalating harassment tactics, culminating in what they called property disposal. Agent Martinez told me that the language used in these documents was consistent with organized crime terminology for arson, and that similar language had appeared in other cases involving the same criminal network. Laura hadn't just hired thugs to intimidate me. She had hired professional criminals to systematically destroy my life. A man across the street shouted, "You said this was for property values." Someone else kicked over the HOA bulletin board. A third recorded everything on their phone, muttering, "TikTok's gonna love this." The news about the federal judge arson investigation leaked to the media within 24 hours, which is pretty typical for high-profile cases involving public officials. Suddenly, every reporter in Colorado wanted to know about the HOA president, who had allegedly hired the mob to burn down a federal judge's house. Laura's carefully constructed reputation as a pillar of the community started crumbling immediately. The nonprofit organization where she worked as executive director placed her on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her as president effective immediately. I have to admit, watching Laura's world fall apart was more satisfying than I had expected it to be. But the best part came when Emily showed me the article she had written for the Denver Post about the whole situation. She had been investigating Laura's background for weeks, and what she had discovered was fascinating. Laura Blackwell had a history of escalating conflicts in every community where she had lived, always using her position in local organizations to harass people who disagreed with her. She had been asked to resign from 2 previous HOA positions in other states, and there were pending civil lawsuits from former neighbors who claimed she had engaged in similar harassment campaigns against them. The pattern was becoming clearer by the hour, and it wasn't just about my situation anymore. 3 days after the search warrants were executed, Rachel called me with the news I had been waiting for. "Luke, we've got her. Laura Blackwell is being arrested this morning on federal charges, including conspiracy, arson, and civil rights violations under the federal hate crime statutes. The maximum sentence she's looking at is 50 years in federal prison, and that's before we factor in the organized crime enhancements." I asked Rachel about the hate crime charges, and she explained that the FBI had found evidence suggesting that Laura's targeting of me had been motivated partly by what she perceived as my outsider status in the community, which qualified under federal civil rights laws. When the cruiser pulled off, I didn't smile. I just turned back inside and rinsed the coffee mug I'd been holding since 5 a.m. Justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just exhales. But then Rachel hit me with the question I had been dreading. Luke, the U.S. Attorney's Office wants to know if you're planning to recuse yourself from any cases involving this criminal network, given your personal involvement in their activities. It was a fair question, and one that would probably affect my judicial career for years to come. How do you maintain the appearance of impartiality when you've been the victim of the very criminals you might be asked to sentence? I told Rachel I would deal with those ethical considerations later, but for now, I just wanted to see justice served. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, and as I sat in my motel room preparing for what would essentially be my debut as a federal judge in the most personal case of my career, I couldn't help but think about how completely Laura had underestimated her opponent. She had seen a quiet retiree who would be easy to intimidate and control. Instead, she had picked a fight with someone who understood the legal system better than she ever would, and who had the resources and connections to fight back on a level she couldn't even comprehend. The game was about to change dramatically, and Laura Blackwell was finally going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong person. But the legal storm didn't end with the arrests. Something darker had started to unravel, something tied to the HOA's money trail, and to a name I hadn't heard in 15 years. The cul-de-sac looked different after the raids. The air felt lighter. At the next town meeting, folks brought lawn chairs and paper plates. No agendas, just eye contact and quiet apologies. The preliminary hearing was unlike anything I had ever experienced, and I've been in more courtrooms than most people see in a lifetime. Laura had hired Marcus Webb, the most expensive defense attorney in Denver, but even he was struggling with the mountain of evidence against his client. Laura herself looked completely different from the confident HOA president who had shown up at my door weeks earlier. Gone was the perfectly styled hair and designer clothes. Instead, she sat at the defendant's table, looking pale and defeated, like someone finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had gotten herself into. Webb tried what I can only describe as a provocation defense, arguing that Laura had been driven to extreme measures by my abuse of judicial connections and intimidation tactics. But then the prosecution began presenting their evidence, and it was like watching a masterclass in criminal prosecution. Agent Martinez methodically walked through Laura's escalation campaign, from the initial citations to the coordinated arson attack. She presented the email correspondence with Mountain Peak Security, the bank records showing the $20,000 payment, and the surveillance reports detailing my daily routine. Emily's testimony was devastating in its precision, presenting photographs, witness statements, and most importantly, the security footage that captured the arsonists in action. When that video played in the courtroom, several jurors visibly reacted to what they were seeing. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a calculated attack by professionals. Tom Anderson's testimony sealed the deal. His 20 years of security experience showed in every word as he testified about the suspicious activity and the phone conversation where Laura discussed implementing a permanent solution. When Webb tried to suggest Tom might have misunderstood, his response was perfect. "Sir, I spent 2 decades listening to people plan illegal activities. I know what conspiracy sounds like when I hear it." The moment that really broke Laura's case came when the prosecution introduced my recorded conversations. Thanks to Colorado's one-party consent laws, every threat Laura had made, every admission of guilt, every conspiracy discussion was perfectly admissible evidence. You could see the exact moment when she realized her own words were going to convict her. Her face went completely white, and she grabbed her attorney's arm like she was trying to physically stop the recording from playing. Agent Martinez returned to present evidence about Laura's previous harassment campaigns in other communities. The pattern was undeniable and disturbing. In every place she had lived, Laura had used local organizations to target people who opposed her, escalating from petty harassment to serious criminal behavior. The FBI had uncovered civil lawsuits, restraining orders, and previous criminal charges that had been dropped when Laura moved to new communities. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the behavior of a serial predator who used homeowners associations as hunting grounds for victims she could torment with legal impunity. When Laura took the stand in her own defense, it was a disaster from the first question. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor systematically dismantled every aspect of her story, using her own recorded words and documented actions. When confronted with evidence of her payment to Mountain Peak Security, she claimed it was for legitimate security consulting. When played the recording of her discussing a permanent solution, she claimed she was talking about legal remedies. By the end of her testimony, even her own attorney looked like he wanted to disappear. The jury didn't bother hiding their disbelief. Judge Morrison's ruling was comprehensive and damning. Laura Blackwell was bound over for trial on all charges including conspiracy, arson, civil rights violations, and organized crime enhancements. The judge's comments were particularly satisfying. Ms. Blackwell, the evidence suggests a pattern of escalating criminal behavior that poses a clear danger to any community where you might reside. The court finds probable cause that you engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation, culminating in an act of domestic terrorism against a federal judge. Bail was set at $500,000, ensuring Laura would remain in custody pending trial. The actual trial 3 months later was even more devastating. The prosecution had built an even stronger case, uncovering additional evidence of Laura's conspiracy with Mountain Peak Security and her history of similar behavior in other communities. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Laura Blackwell was convicted of federal conspiracy, arson, civil rights violations, and criminal racketeering. The sentencing hearing came 6 weeks later, and Judge Morrison's decision was both thorough and creative. Laura was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of just over $400,000, covering property damage, emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages. But the legal consequences were just the beginning of Laura's downfall. The investigation had exposed massive corruption at her nonprofit organization. The FBI discovered she had been diverting donor funds for personal use, including the money used to hire Mountain Peak Security. The organization was shut down, and Laura was hit with additional federal charges for mail fraud and money laundering. Her total sentence came to 18 years in federal prison. Mountain Peak Security was completely dismantled, with its owners receiving sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years for their role in the conspiracy. The ripple effects extended far beyond Laura's personal troubles. The Maple Grove Homeowners Association was dissolved by unanimous vote, and the restrictive covenants used to harass residents were officially abandoned. Property values actually increased by 20% once the HOA restrictions were lifted, and the community began functioning like a normal neighborhood for the first time in years. Emily wrote a series of articles about the case that were picked up by national media outlets, and the story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked HOA power. Several states introduced legislation to prevent similar abuses, and legal scholars began using the case as an example of how civil disputes can escalate into federal crimes. 6 months after Laura's sentencing, I received a handwritten letter from her in prison. It was full of self-pity and claims that she had been the real victim. She asked me to write a character letter supporting her appeal, suggesting that as a federal judge, I should understand the importance of mercy and second chances. I read the letter twice, then filed it away in my desk drawer. Not because I was considering her request, but because I wanted to remember that justice, while sometimes slow, is ultimately certain. Actions have consequences, and people who choose to destroy other people's lives for petty satisfaction will eventually face the full weight of the legal system. I started over with charred lumber and calloused hands, planted a sapling in the ashes. No permits, no HOA codes, just root soil and silence. Standing in the kitchen of my new house built with insurance money and restitution payments, I often look out at the neighborhood and reflect on how much things have changed. Children play freely in the streets without fear of citations. Neighbors talk across fence lines without worrying about HOA spies. People plant the gardens they want, paint their houses in colors that make them happy, and live their lives without fear of petty tyranny disguised as community standards. The transformation has been remarkable, and it's a constant reminder that sometimes you have to fight for the community you want to live in. Laura's appeal was denied. She'll be taking classes in ethics and conflict resolution, courtesy of the state. Mrs. Henderson moved in with her sister, though no one's sure where. Rumor is it's outside an HOA district. HOA rules never created harmony. Mutual respect and human decency did. Laura learned that lesson behind bars, and the entire neighborhood is stronger because someone finally stood up to tyranny disguised as community standards. The moral of the story is simple. Never underestimate your opponent until you know exactly who they are, especially when they understand the legal system better than you ever will. Laura Blackwell gambled everything on intimidation and harassment, thinking she was dealing with just another suburban retiree. Instead, she had picked a fight with someone who had spent decades prosecuting people exactly like her. She rolled the dice on organized crime and domestic terrorism and lost spectacularly. Sometimes justice really is served cold, and it tastes exactly as sweet as you'd expect it to. I still keep the envelope, the one with my picture in the robes, just in case someone else forgets who I used to be. And maybe that's the part people forget, how quiet real power is. It doesn't shout. It watches. It waits. And when it strikes, it leaves paperwork and prison sentences, not bruises. Maple Grove doesn't look the same now. No more HOA board meetings. No more threats in polite envelopes. Just neighbors, gardens, peace. Maybe the real lesson here is never try to control someone when you don't even know what they used to control. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story hit the right nerve, the super thanks button is just below. Catch you in the next one.
QA Stories thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more. Trust us, you'll be hooked.